My name is Walter Kiefer from the Lunar and Planetary Institute, and I am one of the program committee chairs for the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference program committee. This video is intended to to be essentially a training video for people who will serve as either chairs or moderators for oral sessions at the upcoming Lunar and Planetary Science Conference. First thing I'd like to do is say thank you. In my view, the people who run the oral sessions at LPSC are often the face of the conference. They are what people often remember in terms of their experience. And it's your work that helps to make LPSC the great conference that it is. So on behalf of Justin Filiberto from the NASA Johnson Space Center, who is the other chair for the program committee, I want to say thank you for what you do for us. I want to also thank you for the time you're taking to view this video, because even if you have worked with us in previous years before the pandemic as a session chair, our procedures have changed now that we are in a virtual world where we have both in-person and virtual participants at the same time. And that means we have to do some things different, and so we'll talk about that today. I'll start by summarizing briefly the types of both oral and poster sessions that we plan to have, and then I'll spend most of my time talking about the guidelines for serving as a chair or moderator. So oral sessions will be done. They will include in-person and remote presentations in the same session. We will have panel-style Q&A as we've done for the last two LPSCs. This has turned out to be very popular. In-person presenters will be required to wear a lapel microphone. They will speak from the podium on a stage, and they will advance their own presentation slides using the remote slide advance clicker. But they'll advance the slides that they've provided in advance. They will not control the slides otherwise. They have to provide, just like everybody, they will have to provide their slides in advance on a deadline that will show on another slide. When a session speaker is finished, they'll have a chance to go sit at a panelist table in the area where we will be preparing for each Q&A group. Remote presenters will not display their own slides. They will be displayed by the AV text from the LPSC room. They will have to have provided their slides in advance, just as the in-person presenters will. One of the session chairs will advance slides using the remote slide clicker that's provided in the session room, and the remote presenter will just ask for next slide, and then we'll go forward like that. The slides will be accompanied by the speaker's voice, but they will not have a camera live on them during the presentation. And the remote presenters will also participate in the panel-style Q&A. So here's an overview of how the oral presentations will work. You will start for a full session. Let's start with that. You will start with about a 5-minute introduction. It takes a couple of minutes sometimes to get all of the virtual participants into the virtual meeting room. So we need to allow a little bit of time for that. And that's a time when you can start explaining to people what the session is about and any special ground rules you might be using to help moderate or help run the session. And then we will proceed in groups of 4 talks. 4 talks, each 10 minutes long, maximum. Remember, we used to do 15-minute talks, but that included questions and answer. It will be important that each speaker holds themselves to 10 minutes, and you'll have to enforce that if speakers are not willing to do that, because it takes away from the panel Q&A, not just for them, but for the other presenters in their group, and that is distinctly not fair to anybody else. So one of your jobs as session chair is to enforce time limits on everybody. So we'll proceed in 3 groups like that: 4 presentations, a 20-minute Q&A, another group of 4 presentations with Q&A, and then a third one. We have tried at the program committee to get thematic clusters of 4 talks put together. That's not always possible, but we've done the best clustering we can do in putting things together. So people will, we hope, want to stay for a full group of 4. And certainly the speakers have to, even if they're the first presenter in a group of 4, they have to stay because they need to participate in the Q&A later. And finally, at the end, you will have about 5 minutes to just bring the session to a close. There are some sessions that are half sessions. In that sense, we will have 6 presentations in each half session. All 6 sessions will be at the beginning, 10 minutes each, and then a Q&A session of 25 minutes a little bit longer than for the full session, but that's designed to accommodate the larger number of presenters. And at the end of that, it will be time to transition to the next session or to session closure at the end of the half day. Poster presentations. In-person posters will be presented in the poster hall at the Marriott on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, much like we've done for many years. So that will look very familiar to you. Virtual posters, for people who are not attending in person, will be able to present posters in an iPoster gallery that will be available to all attendees through the conference website. Virtual poster session will be on Wednesday evening. We will use GatherTown as a poster hall for gathering, bringing people together for discussion. And we will have actually a special event at the live meeting for people to participate in that event. And more information about how the virtual posters will proceed will be available on the conference website. So the roles and responsibilities for everybody that's involved in a session. The Marriott AV techs are responsible for bringing up the slides in the order it's listed in the program. They provide microphones for all of the presenters, at least all of the in-person presenters. They troubleshoot any issues. They'll watch the Zoom chat for technical issues. There is a private Zoom channel for just the technicians and the session chairs that's not visible to the rest of the attendees that you can use for diagnosing technical problems. We use a group called VFairs to handle the online sessions. They will initiate and open all Zoom webinar sessions. All of these sessions will be recorded, and they will be available for, I believe, 30 days at the end of the meeting for anyone who is a registered attendee, just like the iPosters will be available after the meeting is over as well. VFairs will then close the webinar at the end of each session. The session chairs, they introduce the session, they introduce each presenter, they moderate the Q&A with the assistance of the moderator. If there's any technical issues, they alert the AV technicians to solve things in real time. And for remote presenters, the session chairs will be responsible for advancing the slides with the clicker whenever the whenever the presenter asks for the next slide. The moderator is a new role in the way we're doing this. We went to this system because when you go to Q&A, you will have both in-person questions and questions coming in over the internet in the Zoom webinar Q&A function, where you can upvote, where the audience can upvote things. And it's important to have a third person in the room simply to make sure that there's enough people watching all parts of the channel. In-person presenters will advance their own slides using slides that have been previously uploaded. Remote presenters will be required to join the Zoom webinar in advance, and they'll ask for next slide during their own presentations. So before your session, please become familiar with the presentation titles and the speakers' names to avoid mispronunciations. Know that each session may be supported by in-person and remote session chairs. Excuse me. We have tried very hard to make sure there's at least one in-person session chair. That if we have issues with that at the end, we will try and make sure that that remains true. It's hard to have fully remote session chairs because then who is going to watch? Then we don't know who would watch the in-person questions. So we worked very hard at that based on what people have told us in advance about their attendance plans. The session chairs and moderators should coordinate several things in advance. Any ground rules that they're going to use for the discussion, who is going to advance the presentation slides for remote presenters, and that may vary between the beginning and end of session. Who will do the introduction of the presentation titles and speakers, and again, that may change from the beginning to the end of the session, as it usually does. And then how are you going to moderate the combination of in-person and Zoom webinar questions? The moderator will assist the chairs in managing that Q&A. I'll note that although attendees are given the chance to upvote questions, you should not simply go with the highest voted questions, because everyone on the stage deserves an equal opportunity to answer questions. So we understand that putting people together, there may be some talks that are more popular, but everybody deserves a chance to have their presentation talked about, and particularly if they're a student, they need to be able to answer questions because that's the part of the judging for the Dwornik Award. So again, before the session starts, you should have coordinated with your other chair, the other chair and the moderator, how you'll handle time management and what you'll do for session closure. I ask that you show up for the session at least 15 minutes before it starts, whether that is in person or virtual. I'll note that the virtual session chairs will have a different login from the general attendees because you will have access to different functionality that helps you to manage your session that's not available to all participants. If you're there in person, introduce yourself to the AV techs, or at least introduce yourself virtually. If you're moderating, there will be one laptop at the front of the room for the chairs to use in advancing slides and so forth. But we ask that the moderator bring a personal laptop that can be connected to the session, and therefore you can use it to monitor the Zoom Q&A. That would help us greatly if you can do that. The remote session chairs will connect virtually, and again, please arrive early to make sure that you're connected in the special area for session chairs or moderators. So during the session, you will welcome people, whether they're in person or remote. You'll introduce yourselves as chairs and moderator. You'll provide an overview of the session timeline, which we just went through in terms of how we do blocks of either 4 or 6 talks, and then a block of panel-style Q&A. Please remind the audience that's in person to silence their cell phones. We don't like that going off if we can help it. If you're for the remote audience, ask them to submit questions via the Zoom Q&A function. And for everyone, they should remember to include their name and affiliation when they ask us a question. We want to know who is asking the questions. That's an important part of the conference. So as we continue with the session, remember to remind the audience that the Q&A should be conducted in a civil tone, and it should focus on the science. Occasionally, we have seen examples of demeaning, harassing, or aggressive language, and I just want to remind you that is not considered acceptable behavior, and so please don't let that happen. The Zoom webinar Q&A will be used during the session. We will have a Slack channel available to continue conversation after the session ends, but you should think of that as the equivalent of the hallway conversation that goes on at the meeting hotel. So Slack will not be used for discussing the panel Q&A. You would do that with the Zoom webinar, and you'll have to be logged into the session to do that. We will have a group of people that we're now calling LPSC ambassadors. We should call them microbloggers, who will be allowed to blog, post, or tweet about what they perceive as highlights of the conference. If a particular speaker does not want their material talked about, that is their right to say that they don't want the material shared with. But they have to actually actively ask that their presentation not be talked about. We will not restrict any full session from the ambassadors. It's up to individual speakers if they want to prevent there from being social media discussion. If, for example, they might have a paper in a high-profile journal that's coming out the next week or something. And we want to honor that, but you have to actively ask for it yourself. No one's allowed to photograph or stream presentations if you're a general audience attendee. The ambassadors are allowed to photograph presentations, and they may use them in their tweets and blogs, but they will only do that with the permission of the presenter. They are trained that they have to get that permission before they put material out on the web. So again, remind everybody that the sessions will be recorded and available to all registered attendees in the virtual environment for 30 days after the end of the conference. That means if there were 2 sessions going on at one time that you wanted to hear and you only got to hear one of them, if you've got the time, you can go back and hear the other session by looking at it at some later date. So you actually gain something by having this new format. Please remember that the session chairs are the ones who manage the session, not the presenters. You will control who gets questions and when. It's important that you keep the session on schedule. Each speaker gets 10 minutes, not 11 minutes, not 12 minutes, not whenever they feel like finishing, but 10 minutes. And it's your job as session chairs to make sure that they keep to that schedule. We are a community of session hoppers. That is one of the common hallmarks of everybody I know in planetary sciences. We have multiple interests. And in order for people to get back and forth to different sessions, we have to keep each session on schedule. That also facilitates the judges who are judging the student presentations for the Dornick Award. Again, they have to know reliably when each presentation will happen. Occasionally it happens that presenters might decide they wanted to change the order of presentations. They are not allowed to do that, and you should turn them down if they ask you. The only way you can change the order of presentations is if Justin, Filiberto, or I tell you it's acceptable. And frankly, I don't see us doing that. If there's a good reason for doing that, we will have changed it online long before we get to the meeting. So the order of the schedule is the order of the schedule, and nobody gets to change it. If for some reason a paper has been withdrawn or a presenter does not show up at the last minute, again, we have to keep to the schedule. So what you can do is call for discussion of previous talks in the session or any related issues that might be going on in the session. And then you fill up that 10 minutes until it's time for the next presentation. But don't start the next presentation until the time listed in the program. All presenters will be required to submit their slides by March the 8th. If for some reason they choose not to do that, the AV Techs will present a placeholder slide at the beginning of that talk. The presenter still may give the presentation without slides, and in fact, you should encourage them to do that. I recognize that's more difficult, but they will still have a chance to get their science presented. It will occasionally happen that well, let me put it like this. If a speaker did not get their slides submitted on time, they cannot be allowed to come up with, say, posters or visual aids and have somebody help them with that at the front of the room. That's not fair to the bulk of the attendees, because unless you're right at the front, you will not see the visual aid. It will not show up on the camera if you're watching remotely. So that kind of approach to getting around the slide deadline is unacceptable, and you should not permit that. If it turns out that the presenter says, well, I changed my results after I submitted my slides, well, that's great. Then when they get to the appropriate slide, they can tell us how the results changed. And if they want to refer people to a website after that, I suppose that's fine. We would like both chairs to be actively involved in moderating a session. We have often paired early career and more senior individuals as chairs. Think of this as a mentoring opportunity. The senior individual should not dominate the session, but rather both the earlier career and more senior individuals should share the limelight equally. Again, we don't want individuals or small groups of the community to dominate the Q&A. We want the overall community to have a chance to participate. And that includes both who is speaking at the microphones as well as who is speaking, giving questions in the Zoom Q&A function. If there are, for some reason, no questions from the audience, it is very helpful for session chairs to have questions pre-prepared. This is especially important for Dornick candidate presentations because the way that the students handle questions is an important part of the judging. So I always encourage session chairs to be prepared to step in with a question. In the extended question session we have now, that may be all it takes to get something going. If there is a technical difficulty, remember that our AV techs are usually very good at resolving problems quickly, but the overall presentation still must fit in the 10-minute window. That may require the speaker to be a little bit nimble, but again, it's important that we keep everybody on the same schedule. And you may report any problems you have to the LPI help desk or to Jamie Shambera, who is in charge of meeting operations by email. So during Q&A, please facilitate both in-person and remote participation. In-person audience should be asked to ask their questions from the floor, including their name and affiliation. Remote audience can enter questions into the Zoom webinar. The moderators will assist the chair in making sure that you get the webinar Q&A intermixed with the in-person questions. All questions, whether they are asked in the room or whether they are posed on are asked on the webinar, should be presented in a professional manner that focuses on science. And again, I will say, demeaning, harassing, or aggressive language is not acceptable. If you see this happen in your session, and mercifully it is very rare, um, we ask that the chairs immediately act to put an end to it, and that you also report the incident to the LPI staff at the help desk or to Jamie Shambera so that we can assess whether we need to take any further action. After the session, please report any technical difficulties or unprofessional behavior, again, to the help desk or to Jamie Shambera. You will have the opportunity to give, and for those kinds of issues that are somewhat time sensitive, we'd actually ask you to give a verbal report directly to the help desk. We do ask that at the end of every session we get a report from one of the chairs. You'll be given a link to that in an email before the meeting. That's helpful for us for future planning. We only need one report per session, but it doesn't replace telling us about real-time events that we need to focus on immediately. So 2 upcoming dates that are important. First, on February 21st, we will have a 1-hour Q&A session where chairs can talk to both Justin and myself and answer questions that might not be fully worked out in this presentation. And during the week of the meeting, we will continue to have, as we always have, the morning meeting for the session chairs and moderators. It'll be at 7:30 a.m. Texas time, or whatever time it is for you locally. And if you're a remote participant as a remote chair, you'll be able to join it remotely. It's important that you attend that event in addition to this training because there are always last-minute changes, last-minute announcements that we need to bring to your attention. So I will look forward to seeing you then. And again, the final thing, for everything you do to support LPSC, thank you very much.